biblical war texts, more specifically, how the texts describe the battles or how warfare was conducted, is troublesome to us because we're largely ignorant of history, both in terms of how it's narrated and the practice of war in general. We bump into the sharp edges of history, and in doing so, it can cause us to recoil. But does that recoiling that we experience mean that we're right to feel this way? That's the question no one seems quite willing to answer. Where we seem to most often bump into the uncomfortable edges of the biblical narratives, especially in the texts such as Joshua, Judges, and parts of Deuteronomy, because our English translations render the underlying text in ways that alarm us. And that's something we're going to look at today in this video. So stay tuned. Let's roll that beautiful bean footage. So again, welcome back to the BLOGCAST. I am Triggerman1976. And I want to thank you for joining me here today on this video. We are going to be looking at a fairly recent video. I'm going to say it's been the last month, that was put out by Kipp Davis in response to Gavin Ortland. And it was on the issue of the war texts in the Old Testament. And what we're going to be looking at, I'm not going to be looking at the whole video. In fact, in order to do this, I'm going to split these videos up into a couple of different parts. In this first part, we're going to be looking at the initial, how Kipp Davis steps into his analysis of Gavin Ortland's presentation in his video, both of which will be linked below. Also, if you like what you see here, you like to see what I am doing, please be sure and hit that like button. And above all, be sure and subscribe. I sure appreciate it. And I'm hoping to get I've had some family issues that I've been having to deal with. But if you would like to support me, I would ask that you go pick up a copy of my debut novel, A Turning of Shadow. It is available in both Kindle and paperback on Amazon, and I greatly appreciate that. So, as we go on into this analysis, I want to begin by looking at some passages, specifically from Deuteronomy. And the what we're going to be looking at first is a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 20. And I'll explain why it's important here in a minute. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10, we begin, it reads, "When you approach a city to fight against it, make an offer of peace. If it accepts your offer of peace and opens its gates to you, all the people found in it will become forced laborers for you and serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but wages war against you, lay siege to it. When the Lord your God hands it over to you, strike down all its males with the sword. But you may take the women, dependents, animals, and whatever else is in the city, all its spoil, as plunder. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are far away from you." Now, we read this and we're kind of aghast. We clutch our pearls at just how apparently barbaric the practices outlined in this passage are. However, and this goes back to what I said in the preview, in the introduction, we forget, or we simply do not realize, that essentially, until the 19th century, the 1800s, this was pretty much the standard practice of warfare, even among the quote unquote civilized nations of Europe. That should make us very uncomfortable, but it's just simply a statement of fact. Every civilization had rules of war that were commonly held among the various civilizations. They were understood, they were practiced, and whether it was on the battlefield or in besieging of fortified cities, they held these rules and they were fairly understood by everyone. But it's not just this statement that upsets people, it's what else is said. And it's what comes and when they come to making a distinction between the cities that are far away and those that are in their immediate vicinity. Because it continues in verse 16. However, you must not let any living thing survive among the cities of these people the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. You must completely destroy them: the Hethite, the Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they won't teach you to do all the detestable acts they do for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. Now, the reason such passages bother us is because we look at the names of these groups, the the Hethite, the Amorite, Canaanite, etc. We look at the names of these groups and we tend to think of them like Irish or Polish or even Nigerian. And in some sense that may be correct because there are some ethnic connotations that these names carry with them. But there's something else that these names carry, and it's right below the surface of the text. And it's more akin to like how we would say man or woman. When we use those terms, we're conveying that there's a certain type of stereotypical expectation, more of a description of a way of living that is in reference to these groups. Think of it like how an Amish person might refer to someone who's not Amish as living an English way of life. What we need to understand is that when these names get used, they aren't necessarily referring to people so much as they are referring to a lifestyle that was in distinction to the Israelites. Now, perhaps this becomes more obvious if we look earlier in Deuteronomy, say chapter 7, where it reads, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and he drives out many nations before you, Hethites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and powerful than you, when the Lord your God delivers them over to you and you defeat them, you must completely destroy them. Now, the issue is with the words that get translated, completely destroy them. What do these mean in their context? More importantly, do they mean what we think they mean? Or do they mean something else? And it's just the way the words get translated upset us. Now, I say this because, like I said, we're going to be looking at this video by Kipp Davis in response to Gavin Ortland. And here's the interesting point. It's probably going to shock a lot of people. I'm going to agree with both men, but I'm also going to disagree with them. And I know, you're probably going, what? How's this going to work? Don't worry, you'll see. Hang on. Now, what I need to do is I need to agree that people with an apologetic emphasis, an apologetic direction, have made mistakes. I'm going to admit I've made mistakes, but it's because I did them in ignorance. The more I've learned, though, comfortable I've become dealing with the text. And more importantly, I'm more comfortable pointing out certain errors that people make. Well, what kind of errors get made in the apologetic context when we're trying to defend these passages? Probably it's the fact that most times we try to paint a rosy picture about life in the ancient Near East, especially when we try to contrast the Israelites from other nations. And that's wrong. I don't think in any real way that we can separate Israel from the other nations in terms that would be sufficiently distinctive outside of their cultic context. Even then, some people might say the line gets a little blurry. Now, because of that, what happens is that some people tend to downplay the similarities. See, they want to try to paint Israel as the better, and we can't do that. That's not what the text says. The text doesn't allow that. In fact, it goes to the point of saying you are not better than these people. So we need to be really careful that it's not has nothing to do with what they've done, who they are. It is strictly God doing this. God chose Israel. I'm reformed. That's where I land. Now, the flip side of this issue is that when we downplay those similarities, we will sometimes we will overemphasize certain similarities. And this is, like I said, that's simply the flip side of what happens. And a lot of times critics will do this. They will engage in this. So we need to be very careful in the apologetic context not to try to paint too rosy a picture. We don't need to downplay any similarities, but above all, we don't need to overemphasize. Now, there's one more thing we need to mention, and it's primarily because we do not understand our moral arguments. We don't understand where we're coming from in this. And it's because we have essentially a fundamental misunderstanding of morality. Now, I'm going to give unbelievers a little bit of credit here. Generally speaking, unbelievers have a very good sense of morality. And in fact, I would sometimes say it's often better and more developed than believers or people who would call themselves believers. But just because you have a good sense of morality doesn't necessarily mean what you derive that from is correct. Now, what do I mean by this? Let's say you see some action being performed that you say about that, action X makes me feel sad, angry, discomforted. Therefore, action X is evil. Now, what's the problem with this? Logically. Well, just because action X makes you feel a certain way, be that sad, angry, discomfort, the problem is that culturally, you know, here's the thing. Culturally, we call these emotions negative emotions. And we automatically assume that negatives are bad. So if you feel bad, in other words, these negative emotions, then whatever's causing you to feel this way is by definition bad or wrong or evil, however you want to make that distinction. The problem is that's not always true. Now, I'm not saying the feeling is wrong. I'm saying any conclusion that you draw from that is wrong. So, if we can't make any moral claims based on our feelings, on our emotions, what's the next option? Well, it's that action X causes harm, therefore action X is evil. So we need to realize that here, in this instance, we need to define what harm is. Is it harmful to make someone feel a certain way, be that sad, angry, discomfort? If it is, then, well, you're getting dangerously close to that previously fallacious argument. Well, what about when you say, well, if we define it by physical injury? Then you have another problem because there are some times, such as in a surgery, where you have to cause a physical injury, technically cause a physical injury. So if it's wrong to cause physical injury, that means surgery is by definition immoral. But we would never say that. So where are we left at next? Well, then we get into issues of intent. That is, if the intention behind action X was to do evil, then the action is evil. Now we're getting to the heart of the issue. Now we're getting to the point where we can actually make moral judgments. But then that's where the question lies. On what basis can we say that intent was evil? Now, that's one of the problems we run into when we get into the conquest narratives or the description within the biblical text of that. So, where do we go from here? That's what we're going to see. And we'll see here when we get into Kipp's video. All right. So, in this clip, this is you can see we're about 9 minutes into the video by the timestamp. We're going to listen in, and we're going to hear how this gets introduced.
Half of Gavin's video. I'll just set this up right at the outset. In his video, he makes two main arguments. One of the things I love about Gavin's videos is how well organized they are, and at how good he is at sticking to his outline and communicating the topic in this really nice systematic fashion. And this is no exception. He made this very nice presentation about the conquest of Canaan, and through which he was communicating two primary points about the conquest narratives in Joshua are, first of all, that this is an example of hyperbolic warfare rhetoric, and that these texts need to be read appropriately with this background in view. And then the second of his points is that the other side of this coin, with regards to ethics, morality, and Christian apologetics, is justice, the judgment of God, and the character of God as it pertains to the question of the Canaanites. And the argument being made in the second part is that the Canaanites were irredeemably evil and basically deserved eradication as a result, and that the conquest was an expression of God's justice and his goodness ultimately. So just to
Now, I know I kind of stopped that abruptly, but I just want to say I think Dr. Davis does a really good job establishing the aims of Dr. Ortland's video, which are, first of all, that the conquest employs ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric, and the second is that the Canaanites essentially deserved what they got. That being said, let's move along to this next clip.
if someone could just give me a thumbs up. Thank you, Bishop.
Christianity, in my opinion, it may be the single toughest one.
So
I appreciate.
I'm just going to stop that right at the outset, and I hope you caught what he said there, because I think fairly important that we get this out of the way. I appreciate that Gavin said this at the beginning, and I think it's important for us to dwell on this a little bit. Gavin acknowledges the very difficult obstacle that what I would call texts of terror. These are the texts within the Bible which seem to grate against our moral sensibility. He acknowledges this very difficult obstacle that these texts in the Bible presents for people of faith, and especially for those with a pre-commitment to the scriptures as a divine book. Now, as we move forward, I think this is really key, because this also provides the rationale for responses like this. Apologetics written about the conquest of Canaan only exists because people are beholden to this idea about the special status of the Bible and its importance and its significance. So right at the outset, it's really good that Gavin acknowledges this. He's acknowledging this as a bias and a place where his investigation begins.
All right, so why are these texts in general, especially Joshua, Judges, Deuteronomy, an issue, according to Kipp? And why do they grate against our moral sensibilities? Why is that? Well, it's because people of faith. And by that, I mean, specifically because we're speaking about the Hebrew scriptures, Jews and Christians, they hold a special status among us, and of course by us I mean Jews and Christians, things that we hold in common about these texts. And so what is that special status? Well, in general, when believers speak about the Bible, we essentially hold three positions. And those positions are that the Bible is historical, it is ideological, and it is ethical. Now, what do we mean by these terms? When that basically it means what happened, why it happened, and what are the moral implications, if any, about an event. Now, here's what some people seem to forget when they're talking about these positions. Not all of them, not every story, and sometimes believers have a tendency to draw false conclusions about a particular story because we assume on some level that in every story that's the point of the text. The fact we can detect these elements doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but it might also mean that we're misreading the text and trying to inject something into it that the author isn't trying to do with it. So, when we say the biblical text is historical, what do we mean by that? Well, there's two facts that I recognize. First of all, that the Bible is history, and it's history of a particular people, and it's history at particular times. Now, I speak to this both in regard to the Old Testament and the New Testament, but it's also an artifact of a particular people from a particular time. These are factors that we can't separate. We cannot separate the Bible from its historical context without doing serious damage to how it was intended to function. Now, the neat part is that for these realities to be true, you don't have to be a Christian. And at the same time, being a Christian means that we have certain theological pre-commitments, and you can't forget those either. Simply put, the Bible is what it is. And I think that the late Dr. Michael Heiser in The Bible Unfiltered really drove this point home when he wrote, the biblical text was produced by people living in the ancient Near East and around the Mediterranean between the second millennium BC and the first century AD. To understand how biblical writers thought, we need to tap into that context. We need to get into the worldview of the ancient world shared by the biblical writers, and we need to get that into our heads. The obvious problem for some people is that they don't like the fact that that means they've got to do some work. That means they've got to get underneath the text, because sometimes there's a lot going on that the writer assumes the reader will know about and accept. And that bothers some people. This reason right here is why I believe that modern apologetics as an enterprise should exist to expose people to the text both as a historical and theological phenomenon. That being said, we need to get back to the concern of Davis. And this is what puts so many people on edge. It's that the question of how can you hold belief X in the face of action Y? This, of course, is the real question, given everything I've said up to this point, pointing out that the text evidences its place in history by giving us what were laws of warfare, which were culturally accepted practices, even up to as little as 200 years ago. That being said, there are concerns both Gavin and Kipp express that we need to mention. So, what are these concerns about the text? First of all, there is an interpretive concern, and Gavin or any conscientious reader should have some concerns whenever they're reading the biblical text, any text really, and that has to do with our interpretive reading of the text. Are we reading the text correctly? That is something that we really need to think through. are we reading it in terms of its literary genre? Now, what that means is that we need to determine whether the text we're reading is narrative, is it poetry, is it a wisdom text, is it a prophetic text? Each of these elements necessarily carry implications for how we read and understand the text. It also means we need to be mindful of certain devices that a particular writer might use to tell his story. Now, keeping that in mind, that means that one of the chief means used by ancient writers, because of their context, they liked to heighten the drama of a particular story. They like to use hyperbole. And this is because people in the ancient Near East, just like today, really like a good story. Moreover, they liked an exciting story. Not just a good story or an exciting story. They wanted a well told story. Because ancient people, and much like people in the Middle East today, have what is known as a dramatic orientation. John Pilch explains this as dramatic orientation finds expression in word, language, eloquence, hyperbole, boasting, and indeed heroic gestures, speaking as if the deed has already taken place. These are some of the means available to Mediterranean person to gain, maintain, and enhance personal and group honor. Words and language are very important in Mediterranean culture, for they are related to manliness. The man who is eloquent and capable of strong rhetoric is viewed as a strong man. So when we read the biblical text in light of its context, both its historical and literary context, we have to keep in mind that the writer had available to him a number of different means and methods by which he could communicate to and with his audience. Both, perhaps, when you hear the term warfare hyperbole, you're probably wondering what that term means in practice. Well, in terms of hyperbole, specifically warfare hyperbole, this could include matters of the numbers that are involved. It can include the speed by which an event takes place, hyperbole of severity, which which is where a writer heightens the level of destruction. There's also hyperbole of extent, where the range of influence or authority, or how far the battle raged. And there's also hyperbole of attribution. This is where a single person is credited with the action, with the decisive action. Now, we need to keep these things in mind as we go forward. These are important and they're necessary in our discussion. All right, so in this next clip, we're about 19 minutes into the video. And again, we're just going to listen in because of what is said here.
Okay. So again, I think it's really important to point this out. We need to talk about motives in terms of our evaluation of these texts or these issues when it comes to the Bible. Do we seek for a more palatable reading because of a theological precommitment, or should we seek to better understand the text within its cultural and literary context? How do we do this responsibly, ensuring that we're not projecting our own feelings into the text? Like Gavin comes right out and says as much, right? He's concerned about this issue because he already has this existing pre-commitment to the text, and I appreciate that he's made this that he's been straightforward about. But as I move forward in this video, this is always going to be in the back of my mind here, right? Readings that are evidence-based, faithful to languages and to the broader cultural context through comparative literature, ensuring that we're not privileging readings and ideas of one text over others. Like, these are the hallmarks of conducting responsible historical research. Now, how does Gavin wade through all of that with this theological pre-commitment that he has started from at the outset?
There's a lot to unpack here. But really, I think that Kipp is presenting to his audience a false dilemma or a false dichotomy. Because, hear me out, the most palatable reading should be the one that makes the most sense of the text. Follow me? The most palatable reading is the one that makes the most sense of the text. In other words, the reading that takes into consideration all of the context, not just linguistics, not just the literary, not just the cultural, not just the historical context. It has to do it all. For me, it's not an either or proposition. It's a both and. Now, I think that those who have a problem with the biblical text often fall on the dilemma of how versus why. Because they don't like how the writer narrates the event, and they don't bother to understand why he does it that way. Now, why do they do this? Because they fallaciously assume that if I accept the reading in light of its terms, cultural, literary, etc., what they're afraid of is that when they understand the text, that they have to accept any moral positions that their author might have held in regard to it, and then employ them myself. I don't think that's the case, because I don't think you can get there if you read the text consistently. Now, here's my question. Is Kipp missing the point? Or is Gavin missing the point? Now, in this next clip that we're going to look at, issue is raised about the appropriateness of a particular analogy that Gavin uses. So let's listen in and see what happens.
A fair bit when he said this in his video.
Imagine that you're watching Star Wars Episode 4, the original Star Wars movie, 1977-ish, but you don't watch the whole movie. All you watch is from the moment Luke Skywalker shoots the torpedoes and you see them going into the exhaust port of the Death Star, and you see Grand Moff Tarkin, you see the Death Star gunners pulling levers, you see rebel ships flying away, and then you see the Death Star explode. And then you stop watching at that point. So maybe you've watched a minute, less than a minute. If that's all you watch, that's going to give you one kind of impression. And you might basically be saying something like, why are they killing all these people? You know, if you watch the entire movie and you see that scene in context, you have a completely different perspective. It may not even occur to you to ask a question like that. That's the difference that context can make. That's what I hope this video will do for the conquest of Canaan, situating it in relation to the entire biblical story.
All right. This is a strange analogy. This is a strange analogy to make, especially from an historical perspective. I hope everyone recognizes here, like, Star Wars is fiction, and Gavin is attempting to make an historical case for the conquest. Now, I would also argue, I will argue in this response, that the conquest narratives are also fiction, but they're promoting from a very narrow view of culture and history. So he's right about one thing. If you're going to read particular parts of the biblical story within the biblical story and define what that is, this becomes your overview and your lens for seeing the whole thing. But let's be clear here.
All right. Now, I don't think Kipp got the point of Gavin's analogy. I'm not saying it's a perfect analogy, but I think he just completely bulldozed right over it. The point of the analogy was that if all you saw was that little 1 minute clip, Could you tell accurately what the story was about? Probably not. I mean, we can make judgments based on the visual cues about who the bad guys or who the good guys are, but that's because we have a certain conceptual framework that operates that we can see something and we can immediately make a connection. We have this framework of our cultural narrative that we have certain conceptions or stereotypes that are nested within one another, and which is why I mentioned the fact that the biblical author uses these names of people groups to grab the attention of his audience. But here again, we're back to the issue of context, literary, historical, and we have to ask, where's the problem? Does your problem begin with the text or with the reading of it apart from or counter to its original context? Which brings us to this next clip, which I also find kind of troubling.
Of the biblical story within the biblical story and define what that is, this becomes your overview and your lens for seeing the whole thing. But let's be clear here. Like, the biblical story is a carefully crafted selective narrative. It's propaganda for one side of a much larger conversation. So in Gavin's analogy, if the Galactic Empire is the Canaanites and the rebels.
See, this is where I think the problem is. This is where something that is true, namely that stories can be carefully crafted and even be one sided, can quickly become misleading, or someone can miss the point of the analogy that's being used. Because, and this is important, Gavin's point in using the Star Wars clip wasn't to try to relate to the Canaanites, the Empire, and the Israelites, to the rebels. It was to point out that if we jump in the middle of a scene without context, we can become lost and confused about what's going on, and from that, perhaps draw the wrong conclusions. Now, Kipp goes on to mention that within the Star Wars franchise, there are stories that exist that look at life from the other side of the fence, so to speak. But that point's irrelevant. Gavin's point was that that particular stories, particular narratives, cannot be understood apart from their larger context. See, as a Christian, I recognize the Bible is composed of 66 books, and not a word of it, not a word of those 66 books exists without some relevance or reference to one another, or apart from its historical context, which includes the literary devices available to the author. Now, I am going to say something Kipp won't, because it potentially undermines his own argument. What is that? It's that all narratives are fiction. What Kipp's doing, what I'm doing, what the biblical writers are doing, when you tell your significant other about your day, you're creating a fictionalized account of your day. You're picking a point of view, you're choosing what elements you want to emphasize, and that in those things that you want to downplay, you might be combining characters, you might be creating characters, you might be using hyperbole, figures of speech, you might be engaging anthropomorphism, etc., etc. But the fact is that you're doing those things. But here's the thing. In telling your story, does that mean that it didn't happen? No, of course not. Which is why we have to remember that just because something is fiction, that doesn't mean it's false. Why is this important? This will come out later. Once again, let's see what he has to say.
the stage. There we go. All right. So let's hear about warfare rhetoric.
So here's my argument. The biblical descriptions of these military expeditions into Canaan involve ancient warfare rhetoric, which employed hyperbole or exaggeration for effect of various different kinds, so that if you interpret these passages accurately, it's not describing genocide or a wanton destruction of non-combatants, as commonly supposed.
All right. So we're going to ask as we move forward here whether or not this is even true. Are these texts just when they describe the atrocities of the Israelite combatants and the extent of the slaughter in Canaan, is this just warfare hyperbole that is not describing genocide or the wanton destruction of non-combatants? That's a claim. Is this a true claim? Oh, I got another.
All right. Finally, we're getting to the heart of the matter, because Kipp goes on to produce a slide that has 3 questions on it in regard to the issue of warfare rhetoric hyperbole. And those questions are: does this distract from core issues? Does this help reveal what the text is about? Does this reflect the intended meaning? Now, here are my questions that I want to keep in mind as we're going forward. What is the core issue? Is it an issue with the text, or is it a issue with the reader? Is it an issue with the type of genre that's being used? And can this question be settled exegetically? Now, these lead into our next question. What is the text about? Is it descriptive or prescriptive? Now, this goes to how the reader is dealing with the text in terms of understanding or interpretation. I want us to understand something. When I use the word interpretation, there's a way that the word interpretation is used that is wrong. Interpretation always means, how should we understand the text? Now, there's a corollary, or the flip side of the coin to interpretation is always application. How we understand the text versus what we do with the text. These are 2 different yet related concepts. I have to keep pushing this. So, if you want to understand what the text is about, you're going to have to engage in interpretation, because this leads to my last question, which is, what is the intended meaning? Now, in order to find that out, we have to engage in, guess what? Interpretation. This brings us back to the words that Kipp used, specifically the words atrocity and extent. Now, why are these words important? First of all, atrocity is an inherently morality-laden term. And it's one that extends from one's emotions, which is why I brought up that whole discussion about the fundamentals of moral reasoning back at the beginning of this video. Why is this important? Well, didn't Kipp say something earlier about keeping an emotional distance? Why is he injecting an emotionally laden moral term into his discussion? So just keep that in mind. But then there's the word extent. Why is that word important? Because it goes back to one of the key indicators related to warfare rhetoric. So here's my question. What exactly was Gavin's argument? Let's just reiterate it. This is Gavin's argument. The biblical description of these military expeditions into Canaan involve ancient warfare hyperbole or exaggeration for effect of various different kinds, so that if you interpret them accurately, they are not describing genocide or wanton destruction of non-combatants as is commonly supposed. Now, what's the retort? What is the issue that Kipp is raising? Are these texts just warfare hyperbole? Is that what Gavin said, though? Let me restate Gavin's point simply. The conquest narratives employ Ancient warfare rhetoric as a literary device. This is the point. Gavin's concern is one of interpretation, how we understand what the text says. Are we reading these texts in light of the genre they employ, or are we going to ignore them? Now, I'm going to ask a question. It's probably going to be concerning, it's probably going to be shocking, but it's one that we necessarily need to consider. If we are interpreting the text correctly and accurately, does that mean the text could be describing genocide according to our definition? And the answer, well, of course, is yes. But that assumes that our definition of the term genocide is accurate and it's being applied consistently. And this is one of the problems I have with the use of this term, genocide, is that it often is defined so broadly that it's essentially meaningless. And I'm going to demonstrate this by using the definition as it's found in a source that Kipp himself cites. Tracy Lemos, in her 2015 article, Dispossessing Nations, and the volume Ritual Violence in the Hebrew Bible, writes, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of one of the group to another group. Now, why is this definition troublesome? Let's just consider a situation that's just recently arisen in the past week or so at the time of this recording. Specifically the state of Louisiana, where the state legislature passed a law that was signed into law that allowed the Ten Commandments to be posted in public school classrooms. Now, atheist organizations like the Freedom from Religious Foundation absolutely lost their minds over this, screaming about separation of church and state and all that nonsense. However, what they fail to recognize is that their actions, by the fact that there are essentially three religious groups, Christians, Jews, and even some Muslims, who affirm the Ten Commandments and consider it part of their ethnic and religious identity and their tradition. And elected lawmakers passed this law for Louisiana to publicly remind their children of this fact. And it could conceivably, those groups could conceivably be accused of attempting to commit genocide by that very standard. Now, you might say I'm stretching just a little bit, But when you think about it really hard, it doesn't change the facts. Now, I'm going to skip over the next section, but I'm going to summarize it by saying that Gavin gives a number of examples of warfare hyperbole that have been collected from a number of ancient inscriptions that celebrate the victories of ancient kings. Now, Kipp makes a good point. Those ancient inscriptions are not the literary equivalent of what we have in the biblical text. However, here's a counterpoint. In our Israelite archaeological discoveries and our findings, we don't have anything remotely similar to these types of inscriptions outside of the biblical text. Now, this speaks to a fundamental cultural difference between Israel and her neighbors in regard to how they, as a people, chose to preserve and transmit their history. Now, these are material differences that we really need to consider when we're making the comparison. So the issue is not the material, the physical material. The issue is conceptual. So, in terms of the rhetoric being used, is the rhetoric conceptually contiguous between the two examples? Now, why is this important? Because of how long this examination is going to be. I'm going to stop right here. This is going to be the end of this video. This is going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to be looking at some terminology that gets brought up into this discussion. And we're going to see if these arguments, either Kipp's or Gavin's, holds up. That's all we're doing. Again, I'm Triggerman1976. Please be sure and hit that like button. If you don't mind, hit that subscribe button. Be sure and leave a comment. You can follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. God bless.